The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret Hollis remembered that detail with the kind of clarity that only grief can sharpen, the way it pressed the whole world into focus the moment it slipped from the postman's hand into hers. The envelope was thin, too thin. Her fingers already knew what her mind refused to accept as she stood in the doorway of the farmhouse in rural Ohio, the October wind pulling at her apron, the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney behind her. She was 24 years old, 8 months pregnant, and the last letter her husband had written was still tucked under her pillow, the one where he said he'd be home by Christmas. She hadn't opened this new one yet. She just stood there, holding it against her chest like a wound she wasn't ready to look at. Thomas Hollis had left for Europe in the spring of 1944 with a crooked grin and mud on his boots. He was the kind of man who fixed things. Leaky faucets, rusted gates, the tender silences that sometimes settled between two people who loved each other too much to say it plainly. He wasn't a hero in the Hollywood sense. He was 26, a former farmhand who'd never been further from Clyde, Ohio than Cincinnati. But when the draft notice came, he folded it carefully into his shirt pocket like it was something precious, kissed Margaret on the forehead and said, "I'll write you every week, every single week." And he had. For 8 months, those letters came faithfully, sometimes 2 at a time, sometimes smelling faintly of something she didn't want to name. But they came. She finally opened the new envelope at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten their wedding breakfast 2 years before. It wasn't from the Army. It was from a man named Corporal Dennis Reardon, who wrote in careful, deliberate handwriting that he was a friend of Thomas's, that he felt it was his duty to write, that he was sorry. He told her Thomas had been killed on October 3rd during an assault near Aachen, Germany, that he had not suffered, that the men in the unit had loved him. Then, at the bottom of the letter, in a different ink, Messier rushed, Corporal Reardon had written, "He asked me to make sure you got this. He wrote it the night before. I didn't read it. It wasn't mine to read." There was a second piece of paper folded behind the letter. Margaret unfolded it the way you open something sacred. It was Thomas's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. The way he looped his lowercase e, the way he always pressed too hard with the pen, leaving grooves in the paper like he wanted the words to last forever. "My darling Maggie, I don't know if I'll mail this one. I might not. But I had to write it because tonight feels different from the other nights, and I've learned to listen to that feeling. First, the baby. If it's a girl, I want you to name her June. Not because of any particular reason, just because when I think of coming home, I think of June, warm and long and full of light. If it's a boy you choose, you always had better taste than me anyway. Second, the house. There's a loose board on the third porch step. I meant to fix it before I left. It's been bothering me since September. I'm sorry I didn't. Third, and I mean this more than I've ever meant anything, don't carry this alone, whatever this is, whatever comes. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, and I have watched you carry things that would have broken a lesser person. But strength isn't the same as alone, Maggie. Please don't confuse them. I love you in a way I never learned the words for. I loved you the first time I saw you reading on the porch with your shoes off. I loved you every ordinary morning after that. I love you right now, in this cold, in this dark, a whole ocean away from you. If I don't come home, I need you to know it wasn't because the life we had wasn't enough. It was everything. You were everything. I just got sent somewhere that needed me more. Yours, always yours, Thomas. Margaret Hollis read that letter 9 times that night. She read it until the words blurred and the paper softened from her tears, and then she folded it back along the same creases Thomas's hands had made, and she put it in the wooden box on the dresser beside their wedding photograph. The baby came 3 weeks later, a girl. Margaret named her June. 78 years passed. June Hollis grew up hearing her father's name the way you hear a piece of music, something beautiful that belonged to a room you'd never entered. Her mother never remarried. She never talked about Thomas in a sad way exactly. It was more like reverence, the way a person speaks about something too large to be ordinary. June grew up watching her mother patch the same quilt, tend the same garden, sit in the same chair by the window every evening as the light went amber and slow. She used to wonder what her mother was thinking in those quiet moments. She was too young to ask the right questions, and then, the way it happens with time, She was too late. Margaret Hollis died in 2003, 2 weeks after her 83rd birthday, in the same farmhouse where she'd opened that letter. She left behind a garden, 3 grandchildren, a lifetime of careful living, and the wooden box. June was the one who went through it. She sat at her mother's kitchen table, the same table still standing, and she opened the box like she was opening something she'd always known was there, waiting. There were photographs, a pressed flower, 2 of Thomas's letters that she'd never seen before, and there, at the bottom, worn soft with age, refolded along the same lines 100 times over, the last letter. June had heard about it. Her mother had told her once, briefly when June was maybe 40, that Thomas had written her a letter the night before he died, that a man named Reardon had sent it. She'd said it quietly, matter-of-factly, the way you describe something that lives too deep for casual conversation. June had never pushed. She wished now that she had. She read her father's words for the first time at 62 years old, sitting in the kitchen where her mother had sat 60 years before. And the thing that undid her, the thing she still cannot explain to her own children without her voice going to pieces, was not the grand declarations. It was the third porch step. The loose board he'd meant to fix. The fact that her father, the night before he died in a frozen field in Germany, was thinking about a creaky step on the Ohio porch because he didn't want his pregnant wife to trip. June went outside after she read the letter. She stood on the porch. She tested every step. The third one gave a soft, hollow sound when she pressed it, still loose after all this time, because her mother had never fixed it either. She sat down on it right there, in the cold November air, and she held her father's letter to her chest, and she cried the way you cry for someone you never met but somehow never stopped missing. She cried for her mother, who had read those words alone at 24 with a baby pressing against her ribs and a whole long life still in front of her. She cried for Thomas Hollis, who had pressed his pen hard into that paper like he wanted the words to last, and they had. They had outlasted him by nearly 6 decades, still legible, still alive, still carrying the weight of everything he hadn't wanted to leave behind. She had the letter framed. It hangs now in her daughter's house in Columbus, between a photograph of Thomas in uniform and a photograph of Margaret in the garden, laughing at something out of frame. June's daughter grew up reading it on the wall the way some kids grow up reading Bible verses or family mottos. She knows every word. She named her own son Thomas. June is 86 now. Her memory slips in the shallow places the way water finds its level. She forgets appointments. She forgets what she walked into a room for. But she has never forgotten a single word of her father's letter. She says it's the last thing she thinks about at night. Not with sadness anymore, but with something she describes as gratitude so big it almost hurts. That a man she never knew loved her before she was born. That he thought to name her June. That somewhere in the worst darkness of his life, with mud and cold and the sound of distant artillery, he thought about a loose board on a porch and a woman reading with her shoes off, and a life so ordinary it must have felt, in that moment, like the most beautiful thing in the world. She still has the wooden box. She still has the letter. And every year on October 3rd, she goes out to her own front porch and she sits in the quiet for a while, listening to the kind of silence that holds things, the kind that knows how to keep a promise for 80 years and counting. Some words don't die when the person who wrote them does. Some words just keep going. They fold and unfold across decades, pressed into new hands, finding new hearts to break open and fill back up again. Thomas Hollis never came home, but somehow in the way that love refuses the limits of time and distance and even death, somehow he never entirely left.